Hello and welcome to Workplace Update session number 2, creating a culture of care and not just compliance. In today's session, we talk about how you can embed wellbeing as part of your workplace health and safety system. This topic is beginning to get so important in workplaces, with wellbeing on the increase within businesses. So listen now to how you can improve wellbeing and integrate that into your workplace health and safety system. Welcome. Thanks for coming on this rainy day and coming along this morning to this morning's workplace update. Wellbeing is an essential part of your work health and safety compliance, or you may have also seen it as a culture of care and not just compliance. So Business SA has committed over this year to run some workplace updates for our members and non-members to come along and hear interesting topics and topics that require a little bit more attention, I guess, the things that are coming through. And wellbeing is certainly one of those ones that's on the rise within a workplace. I'm seeing this really in workplaces due to the fact that we've got more awareness around mental health, so psychological risk is bringing in much more importance around wellbeing. We're also seeing the rise in wellbeing due to the fact that it's harder to retain employees, so employees are looking for unique, novel ways of how they can retain their staff, and wellbeing is one of those ways that speaks to people to allow people to stay. And also we're also seeing the recognition, I guess, what ill health can do within a workplace, and so how can we prevent that? So research has demonstrated that having wellbeing within a workplace can decrease workers' compensation costs. We also know that healthier workers will get back to work quicker than those who are unhealthy. And we've got around about a cost savings. Research shows it's going to be varied in different business sizes, but for every dollar invested in wellbeing can give up to around about a $5.80 return. So we're seeing more research in relation to that cost-benefit analysis, which is great to see. So today we have myself talking. So my name's Kylie Cox. I'm the Healthy Worker Advisor here at Business SA. I've been working in workplace wellbeing for around about 5 years, but background is in preventative health and a nursing background. And we're going to have Deb, who is our workplace health and safety senior consultant here at Business SA, supporting, who's been doing work health and safety for 30 years plus. So great wealth of experience and knowledge today. We are filming today, so please don't be too concerned around the microphones and the cameras, but we really do welcome your questions today. And Deb and I have got time for questions at the end, but if you've got something burning whilst we are talking and it's in your head and you want to get it out, please raise your hand and we're happy to take questions throughout the presentation. And thank you again for coming along. It's lovely to see so many faces at this time of the morning. So what we're going to cover off today, I'm just going to set the scene about what the whole session's going to be about. What we're going to be doing is looking at how we can integrate wellbeing within work health and safety in terms of a compliance system. So there's many ways that we can look at wellbeing in the workplace. Sometimes it's more HR related, sometimes it's more related to leadership and management, but today we are really focusing on how we can integrate wellbeing into work health and safety. So to set the scene, firstly, we're going to just give some key concepts, some definitions around the PCBU, as well as key concepts about what health means within the workplace, what is reasonably practical, and what's a health safety management system should include from a compliance perspective. So Deb will talk to that. And then we'll be looking at, within that system, how can we integrate wellbeing in consulting with workers, hazards and risk assessment, what we can do around education and training, policies and procedures. And then I'm going to provide you with a couple of good models around how you can integrate wellbeing into work health and safety. Is that what you signed up for? That's what you think we're going to cover? Great. So I'm going to hand over to Deb now, who's going to just run through those key concepts.
Thank you, Kylie. Good morning, everybody. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is address the elephant in the room. You've probably already picked up, I have a head cold. And here I am along with Kylie, speaking to you about workplace health. Bear with us, we'll get there. I did stay home yesterday. Okay, we're going to start by having a look at the PCBU. Now, those of you who've done some health and safety training before, those of you who work in the area of health and safety, those of you who've worked on the development of policies, those of you who've looked at the legislation, my sympathies, are aware of what the PCBU is. It's the person conducting the business or undertaking, and the person is usually not an individual, unless it's a very small organisation, a sole trader, a partnership, something like that. Once it becomes an incorporated body or a company, then the PCBU is that incorporated body or that company and not an individual. It's the responsibility of the PCBU to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of its workers, and that so far as is reasonably practicable is a little bit of a minefield. When I go out into workplaces, people very often say two things to me. Well, you know what, Deb? If my workers use their common sense and if they follow the policies and procedures, they won't get hurt. Well, nice. Next time you're looking at the legislation, try and find that phrase, common sense. Unhappily, it doesn't get a Guernsey. So what they have done for us is they've actually defined what is meant by reasonably practicable. And it's all about risk assessment. So what is the likelihood of the hazard or risk occurring? And in this particular context, of course, we're talking about what is the likelihood of people becoming ill within their workplace. And they're the kinds of things you need to think about that Kylie will talk to you about later, as some of the particular health risks that are exposed or people are exposed to because they happen to go to work. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not exposed to those risks in the rest of the world as well. But in terms of the workplace, we have an obligation to make our workplaces as healthy as we can, considering the risks people are likely to be exposed to as a result of coming to work. Secondly, if they are exposed to a risk, if they do become ill, how serious could that be? Now let's talk about coronavirus, because it's going to come up today. If somebody contracted coronavirus at work because somebody else bought the bug, how serious could that be? We'll talk more about that later. I'm sure it'll come up in question time. The next thing with reasonably practicable is what the person knows or reasonably to know about the situation in which they're coming into. So the bug that they're bringing with them, the manual handling that they're about to undertake, the silica that they may be working with. What does that person know, or what ought that person reasonably to know about that risk? And that's where we come in as employers. What are we educating people about? How are we going through that process of making sure that people understand about the health risks as well as the safety risks associated with work? In my, as Kylie said, 30 plus years of working in workplace health and safety, I've always found workplace health to be a long-lost cousin. When we talk about workplace health and safety, we always focus on safety. Don't do that, you'll lose your eye. Don't do that, you'll lose your arm. And health is beginning to come through as something that people are now starting to give some attention to, which we didn't used to do in quite the same way that we are now. What's available to help people to reduce those risks? And Kylie will talk to you about some of those specific things around education when she talks again. But what can we do to help people to be well at work? Now, one of the things that I do find when people start going down this wellness program thing, they also start to get a little bit concerned about the risks to their organisation in terms of, yes, but if I get this special deal for a gym with my workers and they hurt themselves at the gym, is that going to come back on me as a claim? Okay, that's another story for another day. But it's how we set those systems up to keep our workers safe, the things we choose to do, and managing our own risks as well. And how much is it going to cost to keep people well? And is that cost grossly disproportionate to the level of risk? And all of these are things that you need to make up your own minds about within your own workplace. We can't do that for you. We can certainly help you. We can certainly pose the questions to you for you to answer for yourselves, because each workplace is different. And it's one of the things that we regularly find when working in health and safety is people want a one-size-fits-all solution. I understand that. It can't be done, because every workplace is different. The risks that you face are different. Your risk exposure is different. Your capacity to manage that risk is different. So this phrase, so far as is reasonably practicable, says to you, in the context of where and how you work, manage these risks so far as reasonably practicable. Oh, thank you, Kylie. I'm turning over the page, expecting you to see it with me. Compliance requires health and wellbeing to be incorporated into an effective health and safety management system. And I touched on that a couple of minutes ago when I said that it's the poor relation workplace health. And it can be a bit challenging because we're all used to, we'll whack on some PPE and that will save somebody inhaling a chemical. We'll put a guard around it and that will save someone getting their arm caught. When it comes to well-being and health, we're not quite so used to coming up with strategies to manage those. And it's going to require us to sit down and do what we did 20 years ago when we first started developing our safety systems. Think about what is it that I am facing in terms of worker well-being and worker health, and what is out there to help me to manage that, and how do I build that in to my health and safety management system. And Kylie will give you some ideas about some of those things when she speaks. Oh, thank you, Kylie. There we go. Now, health is defined in the Health and Safety Act as physical and psychological health. Now, I'm bringing you back into the Health and Safety Act because when we're talking about compliance, that is what we're talking about. What does the Act say I have to do? What do the regulations say I have to do? What do the codes of practice offer me in terms of strategies that I can use to deal with those compliance issues? You may remember the old legislation used to be the Occupational Health, Safety and Welfare Act of 1986. And the welfare fell off of the new title, and we now have the Health and Safety Act. And that is why within that act they have defined health for us as physical and psychological health, which requires us to have a think about the way we run our workplaces and what are the physical and psychological health risks that our workers may face. Do we work excessive hours? Do we require people to work long shifts? Do we have shift work within our workplace? Might we be working 7 till 3 one day and 3 till 11 the next evening? Might we then go on to night shift? How long will that run? How about getting people home safely? Were you aware, for example, that when someone is driving home after working night shift, that their reflexes are very similar to someone with a blood alcohol level of 0.08, which you would be aware of is over the legal limit for alcohol consumption? How do we manage those health risks for our workers? The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease. It does bring in things like our workplace bullying and harassment procedures and policies. It does bring in things around social interaction around the workplace. It does bring in things like isolation within the workplace. It does bring in things like, what about the person who always has to miss out on the birthday party because they must be on the phone? All of these are aspects of this management of worker health and well-being. Thanks, Kai. Now, the elements for compliance include the same as they do for any other health and safety management within the workplace. Begin with consulting with the workers. They are a plethora, or they have a plethora of information that they will share with you if you ask them. What do you perceive? Well, first question is, do you perceive that we have any health or well-being potential issues here? If they're saying, no, well, great. But they will come to you and say, well, do you know, I am a little bit concerned about X or Y, or the vending machine is only full of rubbish. Could we get some healthy options in the vending machine? So consult with your workers and they will let you know what, if any, their health issues are. And they'll also come up with the solutions for you. But remember, so far as is reasonably practicable, you don't go into debt to do it, all right? It's what you can manage reasonably within your normal health and safety budget. Identification of hazards and risks. Your workers will tell you what those hazards are, and together you sit down and assess the level of risk that you and your workers are facing. You've all got a risk matrix in your workplaces. If that risk matrix is well designed, you can use it for your health risks just exactly the same as you can for your safety risks. Training and supervision. What can be provided? And Kylie will talk more to that. It's part of the, and Kylie will also go through the hierarchy of control in a minute. You're all aware of that. What policies and procedures must I have? And I'll talk to you about those a bit later. What health and safety policies and procedures would be nice to have in terms of managing workplace health and safety? And Kylie and I will give you some suggestions later on about those two types of policies and procedures. How do I maintain a healthy and safe workplace? The same way you do now. You do monitoring now for safety. Are people wearing their PPE? Thank you, Christy. Are people wearing their PPE? Are people following the policies and procedures? Are we being effective in our management of these risks? Are we seeing our hazard reports come down? Are we seeing our incident reports come down? Be exactly the same with your wellness program. You'll be monitoring it in exactly the same way that you do for your safety, but you'll be looking at health and well-being rather than arms and legs. And how do I document and report on that improvement? And all of that is already a requirement under the health and safety legislation. You're already required to notify of certain diseases that may occur in the workplace. A lot of you may not be aware of that. How many of you are aware of the notification requirement in the Act if you have a nasty accident. How many of you are aware you have to ring Safe Work if certain accidents happen? Were you aware that you have to notify Safe Work if certain illnesses arise within your workplace? How many people? Show of hands on that. Okay, a few less. So there is a regulation on what specific types of illnesses must I also notify. And they virtually include anything that involves somebody coming into contact with a microorganism within the workplace, where the most likely encounter was within the workplace. We'll talk more about that later, or if you want more information on that, please call me and I'll point you to the relevant regulation and we can talk it through. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Kylie, who's going to talk you through some of the more practical aspects. Thank you.
Great. So I'm now just going to use this as a process for talking about how and where we can integrate wellbeing into this component, and where you might be able to get some other tools to help you do this in your workplace. So firstly, when we're talking about consulting with workers, there's a few ways that you can do this in your workplace. For those who are more in a manufacturing trade base, you may be used to doing toolbox talks. So there's no reason why you can't open a toolbox talk that talks about healthy workers are safer workers, and what do you think that we can do in this workplace to make us safer and healthier, and get their feedback on that. SA Health, Healthy Workplaces have got some great tools on their website as well that allows you to be able to send out surveys to your staff, or do an anonymous survey within your staff tea room that looks at what do they think their health and safety risks are. So there's something there that's already pre-existing. If you're pretty au fait with using SurveyMonkey, again, just a short survey that looks at health and safety risks but more related to health within your workplace, that's really quite useful. And the last one, I guess, that you could use too within that component, if you are a small business, like Deb said, is just to open up a conversation around health and safety. My only piece of advice around here around consulting is just because you consult with workers and they give you suggestions doesn't necessarily mean that you 100% have to put them into place. So please don't feel afraid to ask, because half the time asking is what already creates a culture of care, because people feel like they're already valued by you asking them the question. Like Deb said, it might not be reasonably practical, but at least you know where your staff stand. And always document. So if you've had a conversation and you've consulted, make sure that you've documented that, and it can come back down into this section of your documenting and reporting. So we'll look now at some of the hazards. I guess from a health perspective, a couple of the hazards have been mentioned through Deb about what you might see as health risk in the workplace. And so there could be elements that if we go to head to toe and think about a head to toe assessment, we're looking at components that might happen from a breathing perspective, so silica is quite large at the moment. We're looking at things that could cause skin irritation if you're working in healthcare or if you're using chemicals. Damage to muscles, bones and joints. So musculoskeletal injuries are still one of our largest injuries that occur that are causing issues. And I'll take you through an example shortly about how we can integrate that model of wellbeing and the total worker health model along musculoskeletal problems. Hearing damage is one that's been around for quite some time and probably fairly well managed. Smoking, night shift in particular and shift work is showing really significantly now to be impacting on wellbeing. The studies that are coming out on that are really quite large. And there's some great evidence now that's looking at how we can mitigate the risks around shift work. It's not one of those things that you can eliminate. If we're looking at the hierarchy of controls, we need shift workers. Fatigue and sleep certainly come through very strongly, and the mental health, psychological risks are really quite large as well, coming through fairly strongly as well. And there is some very good tools on Safe Work SA and Safe Work Australia that look specifically at psychological risk, taking you through the direct hazards related. So, 73% of us are stressed at work. And my question when I work to businesses is, well, what exactly is stressing you out? You haven't asked your workers exactly what it is. So for one person, it might be the fact that their role's not clarified and they really don't know what they're doing. And that's an element of psychological risk. For another worker, it might be that their workforce demands are so huge And for another worker, it might be that their communication with their managers is really poor. So until you actually take the time to use a psychological risk assessment tool, you're not going to know how to address that risk and go through a process of eliminating or looking at how we can improve or using the hierarchy of control. And the last one that I wanted to bring to your attention really that can be classified as a hazard in some ways is we are an ageing population. We have got chronic disease coming through a lot more. A third of us as workers between the age of 25 to 65 have got some kind of chronic disease. So in relation to this, I'm talking about, it might be heart disease, it could be heart disease, diabetes, cancer, mental health. So all those elements in relation to chronic disease are beginning to play out. Obesity are beginning to play out in the workplace as well. So we do need to look at those when we're looking at our hazard and risk assessment. I'll just bring your attention now, on your chairs, you will have a copy of this document. So in these updates, we really just want to bring you some of the new evidence and research that's coming through. So this document, it is in a much larger booklet, which looks like this, Fundamentals of Total Worker Health. So I've just taken this page out of it in particular, just whilst we're talking about hazard and risk assessment. So for those who know work health and safety really well, the hierarchy of control that talks about elimination, substitution, engineering controls, administration controls and PPE is the usual what we see when we're looking at a hierarchy of control. So if we were looking at, for example, we've had a health hazard of musculoskeletal conditions, we'd be looking at this and going, how can we minimise the risk? We might substitute that manual task by putting something in place that's going to do some of the heavy lifting, for example, or bring in a new piece of equipment. If we're looking at administration, we would be sending our staff off to manual handling training. If we look at the other side, which is about the total worker health model and how we can introduce health and wellbeing, it's very similar in its nature, but a slight difference in wording. So the main component that comes in here is more about education and the bottom one about encouraging. So we also want our workers to be able to be fit for work, to be able to do their task. And from a manual handling component where we're looking a lot of the time, it's got to do with strength and muscular integrity. We're seeing businesses who are beginning to put in stretching programs in place before their workers are undertaking certain tasks. Or this is why we are encouraging workers to be healthier and fitter at work and outside of work. And that's not necessarily going to pump 150 kilos at the gym and be doing deadlifts, but it's more about, keeping your body healthy to be able to do your tasks at work. So I would recommend you having a look further at the NIOSH website and how they integrate worker health and safety and wellbeing using the model that most people know about the hierarchy of controls. So the second component we talked about when we're looking at a work health and safety management system is education and training. Most businesses would be aware and be looking at health hazards and undertaking training in relation to, like we said, if it's a high risk, manual handling, you may be looking at ergonomics, working from heights, all those ones that I guess are fairly mandatory to having a good work health and safety management system. It could be about the correct use of PPE. There may be some, if you're at a high-risk area of mental health, we're starting to see mental health for managers training come through and psychological hazards. So a few extras, I guess, if you want to move to that culture of care and not just about compliance, is looking what else can be within that training model. So conflict resolution and communication from a manager's perspective is one that's really coming quite large. And from an education perspective, as Deb talked about, we've got this opportunity around providing education to staff around lifestyle risk factors and how to stay fit for work. We've got an opportunity about taking preventative action in regards to how can you prevent any illness or injury happening, for example, around sun safety, or how you might be able to reduce smoking. So it's just going that extra step further when you're creating a culture of care rather than compliance, looking at what you can do in education and training to support your workers further and their health and well-being. We look next at the policies and procedures. I'm going to get Deb to talk to the compliance components because she knows those ones really super duper well.
Sorry everyone, I keep disappearing up the back. I don't want to cough in Kylie's ear or anybody else's face. Now, some of the must-haves for compliance are obviously your work health and safety policy. You've already got one. Make sure it does incorporate health. One of the things I do often find in the health and safety policies is it might be called a health and safety policy, but it only talks about safety. So make sure that your health and safety policy does give a Guernsey to workplace health and wellbeing as well. Personal leave entitlements for permanent workers, be they full-time, be they part-time workers. You should already have some policies and procedures around that in place, around sick leave and personal leave and leave entitlements and all those kinds of things. If you have any questions about what kinds of policies, procedures you need to have in place around that, please ring our industrial relations team. They will help you with that. There's also some complications around which I'm sure most of you are aware of now, a long-term casual employee. What's happening in that space in terms of leave entitlement. So please, if you have any questions about that, please contact our industrial relations team and they will talk you through that process. But part of that will incorporate leave for wellbeing. You'd be aware now we don't talk about sick leave anymore. We talk about personal leave, and that takes into account an ambit of reasons why people may need to be away from the workplace. Maybe a family member's ill, it may be they are ill, it may be the washing machine's being delivered and it can only come on Wednesday. So why are people taking leave and how can we support that within the appropriate workplace policy? What access do people have to first aid? Now, one of the things I regularly find when I go out to do workplace inspections, workplace audits, most organisations have their U-Butte Senior First Aid Kit and their U-Butte Senior First Aider. Lovely. Have you looked at the health risks? Have you looked at what other modules you may need within that first aid provision beyond just what comes in the standard kit? So depending on some of the health concerns that you have in your workplace, you may need burns modules, for example. You may need specific different types of treatments for different types of illnesses that people may incur in terms of a first aid provision. So have a think about what do we have. One of the things that's increasing now, Kylie, please correct me, the mental health first aid providers is now something that people are starting to bring into their workplace. You may or may not have come across that. It's now a thing where people go off and they do their mental health first aid, the same as they do their physical first aid. So all of these are policies and procedures that you may need to consider whether you actually need to have within your particular workplace, given the risks that you have identified when you've gone through that hazard management process. Bullying and harassment, thou shalt have a policy. Safe worker all over it. When I work with employers these days, I tend to call it an inappropriate behaviour policy because I have found over the years that we have one for bullying, we have one for harassment, we have one for discrimination, we have one for something else. I'm a big fan of the KISS principle, keep it short and simple. So we have a policy that covers all of these discriminatory situations that can occur in a workplace and can cause significant distress, both for the people who are being exposed to it, but also the people who are often unaware that they are the perpetrators. So how do we manage these kinds of situations? And having policies and procedures up front, these should be linked to your grievance procedures so that people understand that if a complaint is lodged under this bullying and harassment policy, for example, inappropriate behaviour policy, what is the process that will be followed to manage that? Because that's all part of what Kylie talked about earlier on when she was talking about making sure that we've got all of these things covered off. And thou shalt have a drug and alcohol policy / fitness for work policy. Now this is another one that is becoming an absolute minefield. If you have not reviewed your drug and alcohol policy in the last 12 to 18 months, can I suggest that you do that? We are obviously very happy to help you to do that. There have been a number of fair work decisions handed down recently where employers have had what once upon a time would have been a perfectly adequate drug and alcohol policy, which they have enforced, but the Fair Work Commission has determined that yes, but it missed this bit. You didn't talk specifically about that, therefore you're going to have to reinstate or compensate your employee. So all of these are policies that you must have, but it's not just a matter of sitting down for half an hour and constructing one. I found this on the internet. Please make sure that it is written to suit your organisation, and please make sure that it takes into account current legislation and recent court cases around that particular wellness issue that you are endeavouring to manage.
So if we're going to go a little bit above and beyond, if we're going to go to more of a culture of care, some of the extras or others that can go a little bit further are around fatigue management, and particular around some of elements of also personal fatigue management. So sleep is something that's coming up quite large within a workplace setting, and fatigue management can look at elements within the sleep element, I guess, within fatigue management, not necessarily just related to shift work and hours. Deb touched on flexible work and leave arrangements, but some workplaces are going a little bit further, I guess. They're not just using the Fair Work Commission and what the IR legislation tells them around workplaces, but depending on how your workplace runs, one of the largest key indicators of staff wellbeing is actually flexible work hours. And again, consulting and talking with your team and your staff about how you can do flexible work hours. Some of the issues that come up with this though afterwards normally then discussed, but then, you know, our workers are off at home and we don't really know what they're doing. And there are ways around this, and that comes back to just because you've got a worker who is flexible in their nature and may be able to do work from home doesn't mean that they don't do their work. It means that you need to have a manager who's going to be communicating fairly respectfully and working out what their key performance indicators are and what you're expecting of them, and going back and saying how you went with that. So it's more that check-in process of if you've got people working from home. Flexible, and so that can be put into a policy and procedure, I guess, around what is the expectations that you have if you've got workers who are going to be working from home and those flexible work arrangements in place. Really high on the wellbeing perspective. If you ask your workers, when we talked about consulting, what they'd like, flexible work hours is one of them. The other one that's coming through quite strongly as well now is actually having a separate mental health and wellbeing policy. The mental health policy and wellbeing policy can cover off on a few different elements. I'll talk to that model later, that's a potential. I would also recommend going to Heads Up if you haven't already. It is a website that is developed purely around businesses' mental health and wellbeing and mentally healthy workplaces. It's run by Beyond Blue. They do have some example templates of what a mental health policy would look like and how to create a mentally healthy workplace. But exactly like Deb said, The templates that you get do need to be looked at and modified according to your business structure and design, and that's something that's really important. Smoking and drug and alcohol policies usually are those, quite often we'll see that smoking is actually incorporated as a drug into drug and alcohol as well. But if we're going to go above the normal compliance of what's in these policy procedures, I would just recommend that there is the education and support component in there, and it doesn't have to be much. So if you've got a smoking policy within your workplace, you might like just to add a component of the quit line, for example, where people can get help to quit smoking. So it just gives that extra further advice of where your staff can go if they want to be giving up smoking. And for drug and alcohol, same again. What education and support might you provide to your employees who may be wanting that extra help to provide, to give up alcohol, for example, or they know that it's causing a problem? So we've got some great services in South Australia that can help with that, so it's not costing the business, but a lot of businesses are also now accessing EAP services, and so that should also be written in your drug and alcohol policy. I'd have to say that, talking with Deb too, drug and alcohol is really one that's quite large for me. Alcohol is probably one of the biggest contributors within a workplace. It does cause around about 5% of workplace deaths and contributes to about 15% of injuries. And I think from an alcohol perspective, it's our Australian culture that's drinking is great. And I've done a fair bit of work with apprentices talking about levels of alcohol and making sure that they're zero when they rock up to work the next day. But it's actually the ongoing impacts, I guess, of alcohol within our society that can cause problems. But it's one of the taboo subjects that we don't necessarily address in a workplace. And from a wellbeing perspective, if you're going to a culture of care, I would just encourage you to be brave and to try and address alcohol within your workplace. So that's the policies and procedures where we can, the compliance as well as going above compliance. So the next element that we'll just talk to is around maintaining a health and safe environment. So some of the extras, I guess, if we're looking at maintenance within our workplace, we've got employee assistance programs. So for some larger businesses who can afford that, that's well and great. For smaller businesses who can't afford that, the opportunity is for you to look at other providers that are out there already. So providing advice around Lifeline, for example. We've got services luckily here in South Australia that do offer some free counselling sessions. So if you live regionally, Regional Access is one of those programs. They're run by the Primary Healthcare Network. It allows workers to have confidential conversations around struggles in life. So again, providing that information to your employees. Can I just see a show of hand if we've got any mental health first aiders in the room? Yeah, a fair few, so that's great. So mental health first aid is also, like Deb said, another great course that you can go on. It's usually a 2-day course. It helps you to identify signs and symptoms of mental health within your workplace, how to address that, how to have conversations with someone. And so very similarly, if you had someone who was in the workplace and had cut their finger, if someone was having a panic attack in your workplace, being a mental health first aider would help you deal with those. Healthy food options. I know we've got a suggestion here about vending machines and working canteens. Healthy food within the workplace is quite an interesting topic because we can't necessarily tell people what to eat, but if we are a workplace and we are providing food to our staff through a vending machine, or for example, if we're having catering being provided, the suggestion is that you sort of do a 70-30 split. So we're not saying make everything healthy, but at the end of the day, you're giving people an option of some healthy and some unhealthy. Some of the other things that you can look at doing are sort of those social activities or looking at the needs of your workers and what you think their interests might lie. So we've talked also about our ageing population and being able to provide people with a sense of, what happens into retirement and how to plan for retirement and moving forward, how to stay fit and healthy as we age and get older. Social activities, certainly something that's really important. Here at Business SA, we're looking at combining our health and wellbeing and social activities together. So they sort of go hand in hand, I guess, from maintaining health and wellbeing in a workplace. The other top that come through on a recent survey around wellbeing in the workplace, the top element was about having a pleasurable workplace to work in, which is what workers, when they were asked the question, what's wellbeing in your workplace look like? A pleasurable work environment was one of the top ones. So the social activities and getting people together is one way to be able to combat that and be on top of providing a culture of care. Gym rates we've spoken about, but just I guess for this component about maintaining, we're not necessarily, again, within reasonably practical. You can't afford to give everybody a gym membership, and not everyone likes going to the gym at the end of the day either. But it's actually looking about what might be around in your environment, what's within your 10-kilometre radius of your workplace, where you may be able to link in to be able to get discounts for your staff, and it's an encouragement side of things. So don't think that you've got to do it all yourself within your own budget. There's ways around going outside that. And we've spoken about this one as well. So that's the maintaining a safe and healthy work environment. So I'll introduce you before we get on to some questions that you may have. We've spoken generally about the total worker health model. So the total worker health model, I guess it's defined as policies, programs and practices that integrate protection from those work-related hazards, but it's also introducing a promotion of injury and illness prevention. So this is where we really are trying to integrate health, wellbeing, safety, as well as, I guess, some of those core components of HR. Definitely have a look at the website, which is not on here, but I'll give it to you for those who have got pens and paper there. So if you go to www.cdc.gov/NIOSH. They've got some great tools around integrating health and wellbeing within your workplace. The next one that's coming through quite strongly is a model that really is looking at workplace mental health. I can never say it correctly because I don't have the quite right twang, but la montagne is how I'm going to get it out. And this model really looks at the traditional component of preventing harm. So if we're looking at preventing harm, we're specifically looking at psychological hazards within a workplace. And as I suggested earlier, have a look at the Safe Work website that goes through that process of identification of psychological hazards. There's around about 10, I guess, that you can look at that will look at psychological risk. So that's the preventing harm. That's the kind of the compliance side of things. This model then takes you through a process of promoting the positive. So promoting the positive is all about creating a thriving workplace. It's more about how do we have leaders and managers who are going to lead the way to promote a thriving workplace. It's looking at elements around, like we've spoken about, healthy lifestyles. It talks around training and communication skills. And then lastly in this model, we talk about managing illness. So from a mental health perspective, if you've got a worker who has disclosed a mental illness, or if you have got a worker who you feel has had to have some time off because of some mental ill health, the managing illness component to this model particularly looks at how you might return a worker to work, or what you might put in place, what modifications or what reasonably practical modifications you can put in place around supporting someone with a mental health condition. You will see that this model is coming through quite strongly in a lot of documentation that comes out around psychological risk, but I think this is just a good model in general around health and safety within a workplace as well, that we're looking at preventing harm, we're looking at promoting the positive, and we're looking at managing any illnesses. Because when you think about illness as well from a health perspective, that could be someone who may have diabetes, or it could be someone who may be having an episode of cancer, or it could be someone who is just acutely unwell, like Deb, for example, so how do we manage that well within our workplace? And we don't normally necessarily go to this component straight away when we're thinking about workplace health and safety. And the last one I'll bring you to, if your business is ready to rock and roll, you think you've got safety under control. So most of the time I find with the businesses I work with, if they haven't got their safety stuff sorted out first, the health components and the well-being just seem a little bit airy-fairy and fluffy, and they're not going to get there. And so they're not necessarily interested. But if your workplace is proactive and you're looking at going further and thinking about actually putting a health and wellbeing program in place, SA Health have produced Healthy Workers, Healthy Futures Toolkit, and you can download this from the SA Health website. And this toolkit will actually take you through a step-by-step process of putting a program in place that is looking at health and wellbeing. So similarly to the processes of a work health and safety system, it talks about getting your business leaders on board, so putting your business case forward. It talks about consulting with your workers. It then goes into an action plan. And the good thing about this guide is that it gives you some tips and hints straight away. In their action plan section, you can go through and use it as a little bit of a checklist. For example, if you're looking at healthy eating or healthy weight within your workplace, you can go down the columns of healthy vision, which is more about policies and procedures, the healthy places, so that's more about the physical environment, and then also around healthy people, so what you can do for your staff. So you can use this as a bit of a tick and flick checklist to go, yes, we can do that, no, we can't do that. So I recommend you also printing that if your business is ready to move to the next step of putting in a health and wellbeing program. So that's it, I guess, in terms of us and what we wanted to offer you this morning. We really hope that this presentation turned on some light bulb moments or helped reinforce where you think your business was going around integrating wellbeing within your work health and safety system, and just reflecting on how, I guess, you can create a culture of care and not just compliance. Owners and managers and leaders who recognise and value their staff, who look at consulting with their staff, who go through the process of maintaining a happy, healthy, safe workplace that's mentally and physically safe, will ultimately create this culture of care that's not only good for the individual employee, but is also good for the business's bottom line. So thank you for listening this morning, and we'll now invite some questions.
Okay, thank you. Very excellent question. Okay, you've raised two issues. I'll get to your concern momentarily. Notifiable incidents are different from when someone has to tell you, I'm taking a day off. So the notifiable incidents are the ones that we have to ring Safe Work SA about and say, hey, this has happened. So usually when someone comes into you with a medical certificate that says, yes, this person has been unwell and that's why they haven't been at work on Tuesday and Wednesday, it does leave you in a no-person zone of, well, what does that actually mean? How much digging can we actually do? And to a degree, your hands are tied, and this is why it's very important that you construct your policies and procedures very carefully. Workers have an obligation to notify their employer of things that the employer needs to know in order to meet its obligations legally and also to its workers. So, if I had a cold, I rang my boss yesterday, well, I just sent her an email and said, not coming in today, got a rotten cold. She knows exactly what it is that she's dealing with. In a medical certificate, you won't necessarily get that. And this is why the onus is on the worker to tell you what you need to know in order to manage your business and your workers. So, if this particular worker had a meltdown and just needed 2 days of I just need to get my head in the right place, I've broken up with my boyfriend, or, you know, whatever it might be. Probably not really necessary for them to go into that with you. However, as you say, if they have been diagnosed with some sort of illness that might put others at risk, then the obligation is on the worker, but also on the healthcare provider, to make sure that they have given that person adequate time to recover from that illness before they inflict them back on your workplace. If you've got that culture of care that Kylie's talking about, where people feel safe to say, this is what has happened to me, this is when you're going to encourage people to give you a lot more information. If people don't feel as if they're going to be penalised because they had a day or 2 days off work, if they don't feel as if people are going to punish them because they didn't turn up, they're going to be more likely to tell you those things that you need to know. So it's very much part of that culture thing. There's no hard and fast, unfortunately. Kylie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, good question. And for me, I know with safe work, notifiable incidences around, you know, electrocution, for example, or death. What are the illnesses in particular?
Okay, so they're anything that falls under the zoonosis type illness, so psittacosis, Q fever, brucellosis, all those osises that people get when they handle or work with animals. It applies a lot to people who may work in a healthcare environment, may work in a veterinary environment, but it also says, or any other microbiological exposure that the person can definitely link to work. So let's say, for example, you work in a lab where you handle pathology and you contract an illness that you certainly didn't get sitting on the bus, then those are the kinds of illnesses that are notifiable to Safe Work SA. If somebody's got diarrhoea, Safe Work don't care, okay, unless it's come from one of those notifiable situations.
But very, I guess from a communicable disease perspective in the workplace, when it comes to cold and flu season, and also when it comes to those kind of vomiting and diarrhoea, we all know from a school perspective or a childcare, we need to not have our children exposed to other children, and that's really the same from a workplace perspective. It is, a worker has to also consider the health and safety of others. And so I agree, when you're looking at policies and procedures, and you're inducting your employees, it's important to tell them those types of things actually are important within our workplace as well. Sometimes you need to be that explicit. If you are coming to work with a cold or a flu or some kind of virus, this is what we expect in our workplace.
Working from home, again, I know we keep coming back to policies and procedures, but it is a lot around that. And yes, you're absolutely right. If you're going to have someone working from home, they do have to have the appropriate environment within which to work. The way we handle it here every year, because I do some work from home, every year I have to provide a photograph of where I work. I have to complete an ergonomic checklist that I submit. Some people, where they have workers who possibly wouldn't know how to go about that, they'll send someone out to the workplace to actually do that assessment. It's one of the things that we offer, is we will go out to people's homes and do that assessment for you. But then there is about the annual review of coming back and making sure that it's still working. There is no guarantee. I'll cite a work cover claim for you from Queensland, but it could be just as relevant here. Worker had her office space upstairs. She went downstairs to make a cup of tea. She fell on the stairs and she broke her leg and she lodged a claim. Now, the workplace refused the claim, saying, well, I'm not responsible for your staircase. Fair Work's response was, well, if she had fallen over going to make a cup of tea in the workplace and broken her leg, you would have had to accept that claim. There is no difference. So it's not like we can just create a zone and say that is your workspace and that is not. The courts will have a look at it in the whole context of how that injury occurred and whether in a workplace situation would that have been acceptable or not. No guarantees. With the work-sponsored scenario, there's untold cases where what it tends to hinge on is, did the employee feel compelled to attend? So if the employee feels as if reasonably feels as if they're going to be ridiculed or punished or ostracised in some way because they didn't turn up or because they didn't drink alcohol, then that will come back on the workplace, because that will indicate that the workplace has not created the appropriate culture to enable people to say, yeah, I'm happy to come, but I'm not drinking, and not be ostracised for that. Or, you know what, thanks anyway, but I'd rather not, and not feel as if they're ostracised when they come back on Monday. So that tends to be how that's approached. In terms of things like gym membership, how did you handle that? So did you encourage people in such a way that they felt they really had to go to the gym? Or have we simply presented options to people to say, okay, these are some of the things that are out there. We've done a deal with the gym that, if you rock up and say, yeah, you work here, they'll give you a 10% discount. That is a decision that the employee has made. You haven't put them in a position where they feel as if they have to participate.
Great. And I'd just add to that, it comes back to the risk assessment as well. So if you've undertaken a risk assessment, so say for example you are going to run a cricket match on the weekend, it would be good for you to go through a process of looking at what the hazards and risks are of running that event. So in some ways you have gone through a process using your safety management system to look at the risk of that event, to recognise that it's highly unlikely that something's going to occur, and it outweighs the benefits of the social interaction of staff attending an event like that. So that would be my suggestion there. I have had businesses who have gone through the setting up a gym actually at their workplace, hiring the equipment, ensuring that the equipment was, it was hired so it was a high quality standard, and then they got their staff to sign waivers. Staff who had to use the facility also needed to have health checks with their GP before they went in, because their staff wanted it, but they also needed to minimise the risk that goes alongside having it. So it is actually working within your means. I would agree with you though, there is a larger importance being placed around mental health within the workplace, and I believe that's coming from the awareness around the statistics with our culture and our society with depression, anxiety and mental health conditions. So now we've got the awareness, we've got to play catch up with what we do next within a workplace, and some of the models I've showed you today. We also, if you want to go further in that, we offer training around mental health for managers, which is a good course to go on to, and our courses around work health and safety touch more in a lot more depth about what we've spoken about today. So some of the courses and the consultancy services, so Deb's available from a work health safety and perspective, and our HR specialists can also help you around some of your policies and procedures within your workplace, and also returning to work if you require that, if you've got someone who's returning to work after an illness. So have a look through that book. And the other one, just to highlight too, for those of you who are in a small business or know a small business owner, we've recently launched the Small Business Guide. The first part of this book, although it's around small businesses, around looking after your own health and well-being, which is just as important. If you're a manager or a leader and you're trying to look after everyone else's well-being, who's looking after yours? So the first half of this book is around that. The second half is what you can realistically do as a small business owner to support the health and well-being of your staff. So have a look at the back section of that book for that. Okay?
Great.
Very good. Thanks everyone. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.